On Friday morning, the news broke that the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan, who was a mainstay in the Florida wrestling scene, later on in WCW as well, both in the ring and behind the scenes, passed away at the age of 75. And he was in poor health the last few months after suffering what his family described as a devastating accident during an autograph signing. That was back in May. And he underwent emergency surgery to save his leg. They saved his life. He ended up getting sepsis and encephalitis, which is an inflammation of the brain. I remember years ago here in New York, they used to have airplanes flying overhead here, spraying for mosquitoes because people were contracting encephalitis from mosquito bites. He was in and out of the ICU. His family set up a GoFundMe that raised over $50,000 to help with his medical expenses. They said he had great insurance, but it didn't take long for that coverage to be wiped out because of how long of a stay he had in the hospital. I mean, that could bankrupt you very quickly in this country. Lots of people donated. I know Tony Khan dropped $10,000. Jim Cornette dropped $5,000. Chris Jericho, Mick Foley, Cody Rhodes, DDP. He had a lot of people in his corner cheering him on, and a lot of fans in terms of other wrestlers who learned a lot from him, liked him, knew him, worked with him or for him in some way. But in the end, it wasn't enough. WWE acknowledged his passing on its website and with a video on SmackDown on Friday night. I would imagine that video will play during Raw this Monday as well. He was never the biggest, most physically imposing guy. Yeah, he was only 5'9". Superstar Billy Graham once said that Blackjack Mulligan, when he would work with Sullivan, would have to get down on his knees, and he was still taller than Kevin Sullivan was. But he was believable. He was believable, especially in those early days of his career. He worked really well with the bigger guys. He never had a proper run in WWE, although he did work enhancement matches there in the mid-'70s for a couple of years. Probably about 2 or 3 years. I mean, him being an East Coast guy, and I mean, you just listen to him speak, and you could tell right away where he's from. You could tell, okay, that's a New England guy right there. But him being an East Coast guy, I would be very surprised if he didn't work at least a few matches for WWE back then. But it was always at the lower end of the card. Where he found his first real success was championship wrestling from Florida. He was the Prince of Darkness, Kevin Sullivan. He was a satanic cult leader with his Army of Darkness. And he really tapped into that whole satanic panic of the 1980s. Nancy, his wife, or who would later become his wife, was part of that group. She would go on to simply become known as Woman. And, of course, in WCW, he became the leader of the Dungeon of Doom, which was responsible for some of the worst television that you will ever see. I'm sorry, it was awful. If you were a wrestling fan back then, mid-90s, WCW, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Very lame, very cheesy, probably very on brand for wrestling at that time. The Dungeon of Doom is something that would have worked in, early 90s WWF. And they mainly served as foils for Hulk Hogan to beat. When they brought Hogan in 94 and gave him that ticker tape parade and made him the champion, Hogan wanted big guys that he could beat. And that's what Sullivan gave him. That's what the Dungeon of Doom was. Although it did give us the unintentionally hilarious moment where Hogan is transported. I talk about Lucha Underground, right? Cinematic, and it was ahead of its time in many ways. Well, the Dungeon of Doom gave us some cinema of its own, and there was one unintentionally hilarious moment where Hogan is transported to their evil lair. He doesn't know where he is, and he sees a water fountain, and he touches the water, and then he pulls back and he shouts, "It's not hot!" That still lives rent-free in my head. Like, I could understand shouting, "It's hot," but to shout, "It's not hot," I never understood that. But the Dungeon of Doom, it also gave us the debut of the Giant. And I think that guy went on to do some things in the business. The thing is, as cheesy as so much of this was, Sullivan still got to feud with Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan was still the biggest name in the business at that time. He was Hogan's top nemesis for a while there. So it was not a bad spot for him to be in. He even got to have a match with Mr. T. Starrcade, 94, the same show where a young Triple H made his one and only WCW pay-per-view appearance. Not long after that, he left for WWE. But yes, Kevin Sullivan actually had a match. It was terrible. It was not good. It was short. So that's maybe the best part about it. But he had a match with Mr. T. Later on, the Dungeon of Doom went on to feud with the Four Horsemen. And that is what gave us the infamous strap match with Brian Pillman, where the winner would have to tell the other man that he respects them. Not 60 seconds into the match, Pillman grabs the microphone away from the referee and says, "I respect you, Booker man," and he leaves the ring. Now, this was at a time when Pillman was starting to work the loose cannon gimmick, and Sullivan was booking, or he was helping out with the booking behind the scenes, hence the Booker man line. And it made for an awkward moment because the announcers wouldn't acknowledge that part of what he said, and it made no sense that he would give up so easily, and then he would just walk out. But boy, did it get people talking, which was the whole point. So Sullivan has claimed he was in on it. Bischoff would have had to have been in on it. I mean, Bischoff ended up working him into a firing so that he could leave and go somewhere else to make the angle more believable. So I can't imagine that Bischoff was not clued in, and they may have been the only ones. And so not only did he kind of work Bischoff into giving him a release so that he could go show up in ECW and he can, make things a lot more legitimate looking, he ended up making a deal to go work for Vince McMahon. Now, Bischoff will say that it was all part of the plan, and he kept in contact every week with Pillman the whole time that he worked for WWE. What's true and what's not, we'll never know for sure, because I don't trust everything that comes out of Eric Bischoff's mouth. I always just love the idea that he had lawyers at Turner draw up real termination papers for Pillman to make it more legitimate, which he then took for real and used to sign a deal with Vince. So, I mean, whatever you believe, a lot of the talent thought it was real. What happened in the match with Sullivan. Sullivan said one of the best compliments he ever got in his life was from Kevin Nash, when Nash was still working for WWE. And he told Sullivan, and I don't know when he told him this, he might have told him this after, because it was the same year that he went to go work there. But he told Sullivan a bunch of the boys on their roster bought the pay-per-view after, I guess, the replay to see the shoot, or what they thought was a shoot. See, that's when you know you got them. When you can convince your own peers that it must be real, then you got them. But he said it was all Brian's idea. He always, in any shoot interview I've ever seen him do, he always gave Pillman credit for the idea. Pillman was something else, man. I mean, also like Sullivan, he was an undersized guy in a big man's business. And he had a ceiling where he was, before, when he was flying Brian. He was very talented, but he was only going to go so far in that company. And he knew that. He knew he had to change it up and do something to get noticed if he wanted to be a bigger star. And that's what he did. He had people in that company, he had the fans convinced that he was out of his mind. He had them convinced that he was legitimately crazy and very unpredictable. And he was a loose cannon. You never knew what he was going to say. You never knew what he was going to do. If only he didn't get in that Humvee wreck. Who knows how far he may have gotten. I mean, he had drug problems anyway, but we'll never know. But then there's his famous and very personal feud with Chris Benoit. Now, it started out of the Dungeon of Doom feud with the Horsemen and Sullivan's feud with Pillman. After Pillman left, Sullivan feuded with another Horseman, that being Benoit, and it led to one of my all-time favorite matches in WCW history. In fact, I had it on my list of the top 15 matches in WCW history. Sullivan against Benoit, Falls Count Anywhere, at the Great American Bash 1996. Now, there have been far crazier matches since then. Like, if you watch that match through 2024 eyes, you might look at it and go, what's the big deal? Right? But it was pretty novel at the time to see that. When you see these two guys fighting through the crowd into the men's bathroom and fans are all around them, and you've got Dusty Rhodes on commentary freaking out when he spots a woman in the men's john. There's a lady in the men's bathroom. I can't even do it justice. Like, you have to go back and just hear it for yourself in his voice, in that accent. He famously booked his own divorce in that angle, when Woman sided with Benoit over Sullivan. He was booking at the time, and he wanted them to really make it look real. So they would travel together and they would room together. You'd see them out in public. They'd be holding hands. And, when you do that, you would hope, they're two adults who are at work. I mean, this is their job and this is what they're expected to do. But you spend enough time around somebody and look, you're just tempting fate. Sullivan had said that he and Nancy were already living apart most of the time in separate houses in Florida. I think one of them was in the Keys. The other one was in Daytona. So they knew they were headed for a divorce anyway. But he claims he never suspected anything might happen because Benoit had a pregnant wife at home at the time. And he was concerned, Benoit was, when the angle was pitched to him, that his wife might be upset. So even Benoit had reservations about doing it, but she was pregnant, and Sullivan said that he never thought Benoit would leave his wife for Nancy, which is what he ended up doing. So that's where the whole he booked his own divorce thing comes from. You skip ahead a few years, at the beginning of 2000, there was a lot of political turmoil behind the scenes in WCW and a lot of jockeying for power between Sullivan and Vince Russo over booking. Benoit and a bunch of other wrestlers, they refused to work for Sullivan. And Benoit for obvious reasons, because there was a lot of heat there and tension there. Benoit thought Sullivan had undermined him and sabotaged his career when Sullivan had previously been in control of the booking. Benoit went on this horrible losing streak in pay-per-view matches one year. I think it might have been 98. And he blamed Sullivan for it. Rightly or wrongly, he held him responsible for that. And even though Sullivan is the one who made the call to put the WCW title on Benoit at the beginning of 2000, I guess to try to prove, hey, I'm a fair guy, right? You can work with me. Benoit still left the company. And he took Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn with him because they all banded together and they asked for their release. It was all one big revolt against Sullivan and his booking that ultimately led to the Radicals getting their releases and jumping ship to WWE. Now, Sullivan, he got a lot of crap after the Benoit murder-suicide from fans, accusing him of killing them both or he was there, he had a role in it, it's his, they tied it back to his satanic character and the feud with Benoit because Benoit stole his wife. It was all bullshit. He didn't have a damn thing to do with any of that, but people joked about it anyway. Some people are probably dull enough to actually believe it, but it was just conspiracy theory nonsense. He was with Nancy for over a decade of his life. They got together in 85. I don't think they actually married until many years later. But I'm sure it ripped him up inside when he heard about what happened. I mean, how can you? If you're Kevin Sullivan on some level, now I don't want to say feel responsible, like it's all his fault. But it was his idea to book Nancy to leave him for Chris on TV. That angle is the reason that Chris and Nancy ended up falling in love and getting married in real life. If they don't get together, they're probably both still alive today, or at least Nancy is. That's got to be a hard thing to think about when you see how it all ended. It's just a really messed up situation. I don't know if he's ever commented on that before or not, but again, not that he should feel like he's responsible for what happened, but just if I were in his shoes and I was the one who booked that whole thing, and that's how they ended up together, and then we see what happened, 10 years later, I don't know. It would just, I feel like it would be a mindfuck. It would be a difficult thing to try to process. But he was definitely an influential figure in the business. He had a major hand in the booking of WCW at times in the mid to late 90s. It's very likely that some of the aspects of WCW television that you liked and that led to their boom period, Kevin Sullivan had a hand in. I saw Tom, the person who runs the WCW Deep Cuts Twitter page, mention one idea that I had not known about from the 96-97 period. Sullivan hired about half a dozen big guys, like Roadblock. Remember him? Remember Roadblock? He would hire these guys, and you would think, why would you hire all these big guys when you have the Giant? Why make the Giant look less imposing by kind of surrounding him by all these other big men on the roster? Well, his idea was you would have your top baby faces go through those guys and beat them with their finish, whatever their signature move was. So you would think that they actually had a chance in there with a guy like the Giant. It gives your babyface credibility. It's a lot more impressive for Goldberg, to go in there and beat a guy like that than someone like Brad Armstrong. And that's not a slight on Brad Armstrong. He could work circles around Roadblock, but he wasn't the most physically imposing guy. One of the most impressive things was the night that Goldberg beat Raven on Nitro to win the U.S. title. When the Flock runs in and he's throwing Flock out left and right, Sick Boy and Kidman, I think Horace Hogan was in there. But he lifts Reese up into the air, and Ron Reese was like 7'1", 7'2", legit. Like, he just picks him up like he's nothing and gives him a jackhammer. He did that to Reese a few times. Roadblock too. So when he finally got the Giant up and he held him there for like a few seconds, I had never seen anything like it in my life. When Goldberg picked the Giant up straight up into the air, and the Giant is working with him, and the Giant back then was a lot more a lot more svelte than he would be in WWE, where he really let his weight get away from him. But he's still a big guy. I mean, he's legitimately a giant. He's 400 pounds or whatever he was. I had never seen anything like that in my life. But it's smart. Not everybody thinks like that. And there were bad ideas too. There were bad Kevin Sullivan ideas too, to be fair. But he gets more praise from other wrestlers for his acumen behind the camera than I think he does even in front of it. One of my favorite little stories, Kevin Nash tells it, was the night after WrestleMania 14 when Vince brought Mike Tyson in. And Nash sees Sullivan in Nitro the next night. And Sullivan tells him, "Feel that, Nash? Water got a little cold last night. Hit an iceberg called WrestleMania." Because he knew, he knew the tide was about to turn in the other direction. You could just feel it. And that's exactly what happened. He was a huge Boston Red Sox fan. Now, the Red Sox paid tribute to him last night at Fenway Park during their game with the Astros. They had a message up on the scoreboard that read, "In memoriam of Kevin Sullivan, you will be missed. Love, Red Sox Nation." That's pretty damn cool. And I didn't get a chance to mention this on the last show because I was so hung up on SummerSlam stuff, so I'll mention this here. I watched Steve Mongo McMichael's induction last Saturday into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. They always have the ceremony in Canton, Ohio, which is where the Hall of Fame is located. And with any luck, one of these years we'll get a physical WWE Hall of Fame somewhere that people can visit. There are more Chicago Bears in the Hall of Fame than any other team. And Mongo, before he got into pro wrestling, was most famous for his time with the Bears and their Super Bowl win in '86. He appeared ringside for the main event at WrestleMania 11 when Lawrence Taylor wrestled Bam Bam Bigelow. Later that year, Eric Bischoff signed him to a WCW contract as a color commentator when Nitro first started. Remember, he had his little dog Pepe, with him every week. The dog looked scared shitless. Eventually, he got into the ring. He ended up as one of the Four Horsemen. He even won a United States Championship. Probably had more defenses than Logan Paul did. Not only did they have their usual ceremony in Canton, but at the same time, they were broadcasting from his home in Illinois, where he was surrounded by his old teammates who were flown in on a private plane. And his family was there, his wife, Misty, his daughter, Macy. They were at his bedside to present him with his official Hall of Fame bust. And it was a really tough thing to watch. It was very emotional. For those who don't know, Mongo was diagnosed in 2021 with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig is one of the greatest baseball players of all time. He was only 35 or 36 when he was diagnosed with the disease. He's probably the most famous person associated with it. I mean, Stephen Hawking, I guess, would be the other. But it's a horrible disease. Just the idea of being diagnosed with it scares the shit out of me, just thinking about it. Because there's no cure. And it affects all of the nerves in your body that control voluntary muscle movement. And as those nerves waste away and they slowly die, over time you can't walk, you can't talk, you can't swallow, you can't even breathe on your own. Your mind still works. So you're effectively trapped inside a body that no longer does. And yet, there was Mongo still hanging in there because he wanted to live long enough to see himself be enshrined in the Hall of Fame. And he was bound and determined to make it to Canton for the ceremony. He couldn't physically be there, though, so they brought the Hall of Fame ceremony to him. And there has never been a Hall of Fame induction like it in any sport. I mean, none that I've ever seen. As sad as it is to see him in that condition, I'm really happy he got that moment. That was special.